welcome to Urban Trees, bringing the canopy to all. This is the first of 3 60-minute webinars over the next 3 weeks. My name is Victor Reyes, Program Manager at Sustainability Network, coming to you from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Sustainability Network is a nonprofit capacity builder that has been serving the environmental nonprofit community since 1997. We help nonprofits lead, manage, and strategize. Learn more by visiting our website, sustainabilitynetwork.ca. This webinar series is brought to you in partnership with Nature Canada, one of the oldest national nature conservation charities in our country. Today, we are joined by around 400 people who have registered for this webinar series, coming from all 10 provinces of Canada, plus the Yukon. We are also joined by friends from the US, Mexico, and Brazil. Participants represent national NGOs such as the Jane Goodall Institute of Canada, American Bird Conservancy, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, Birds Canada, Nature Conservancy of Canada, David Suzuki Foundation, regional and provincial NGOs such as Sierra Club BC, Nature Quebec, Saskatchewan Parks and Recreation Association, Conservation Council of New Brunswick, Climb Atlantic, and various conservation authorities, including the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, Conservation Halton, Ganaraska Region Conservation Authority, among many others. Foundations such as the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, McConnell Foundation, Max Bell Foundation, various levels of government, such as the City of Lethbridge, Peel Region, Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and other institutions such as the University of Alberta, University of British Columbia, Toronto District School Board, among others. Now, some housekeeping rules. Please type in your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. Feel free to use the chat box to interact and share resources with each other. A recording of this webinar and the presentation slides that will be used will be made available and the link emailed to you within 1 business day. And now to tell you more about Nature Canada and to introduce our presenters, let me pass the floor to Maddie Tureen of Nature Canada. Maddie, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I just want to say thank you to Victor and the Sustainability Network for partnering with us on this series. My name is Maddie, and I'm the reforestation organizer at Nature Canada. So just a bit about us for anyone who might not be familiar. We're one of the oldest national nature conservation organizations in the country. We represent a wide network of members and nature organizations working towards discovering, defending, and enjoying nature. So I'll just introduce our first speaker for today. It's Christine Earnshaw from Tree Canada. So Christine manages Tree Canada's involvement in the Growing Canada's Community Canopies program. And today she'll be giving a brief overview of what tree equity is, providing some historical context, and getting into some of the work that Tree Canada has been involved in so far on this issue. So yeah, over to you, Christine.
Oh. All right, well, thank you very much. I'll start by sharing my screen. All right, well, before I begin, I would like to give a land acknowledgement since I am based in Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence and connection to this land reaches back to time immemorial. I send my respect and appreciation to all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples for their past and present stewardship of these lands. And I also want to say I'm happy to be here today on behalf of Tree Canada to share our perspectives and experiences. And I'd like to say thank you to Nature Canada and Sustainability Network for hosting this important series to help us continue the conversation and the ongoing learning and questioning we can all do to strive for tree equity in our cities. So today I'm here to speak about Tree Canada, and what I hope to cover in this presentation is a little bit more about the organization and just some perspectives on what tree equity is and how we are applying it in our programs and initiatives. So Tree Canada is an organization founded over 30 years ago, and it's the only national not-for-profit organization dedicated to planting and nurturing trees in both rural areas and urban environments in all provinces across the country and now a territory, Northwest Territories. So the organization, we are thought leaders and capacity builders. We collaborate with a lot of different industry experts and professionals who are also thought leaders and academics and other non-governmental organizations to deepen knowledge and to help communities to not only plan and sustain their local canopies, but to grow and expand them. So today I'm going to be talking about a couple different initiatives of Tree Canada. So not all of them necessarily, but I'm going to be selective in terms of talking about how we have applied equity into our considerations and programming through the different ones and different angles that we have. So one of them is through Greening Communities. It's a national granting program where we provide funding and support to communities on tree planting projects. Another one is an afforestation and restoration program that we have for large landowners. And this is planting large numbers of trees to support afforestation. Another area that I'll talk about is Tree Canada's involvement with research and engagement on specifically this topic of urban forests and how recently we've been focusing on tree equity as a major sub-theme, an area of inquiry in relation to urban forests. And finally, through capacity building initiative on a program that I'm currently working on, which is the Growing Canada's Community Canopies program in conjunction and collaboration with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. So let's just step back and ask the question, why does equity matter in urban forestry? Why should there be trees for all? And I'm sure this is no surprise to anybody on this webinar today, how vitally important trees are for our communities. Trees draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they emit oxygen, they cool the air in the ground, they absorb stormwater and hold soil in place, they absorb pollutants and fine particles, and ultimately they make our towns and cities more livable and resilient to climate change. And fundamentally, trees are enormously important for our mental and physical health and well-being. And I was on a webinar recently. I was participating and joining a webinar, and the host asked the question, how have trees impacted you in the last week or so? And so this is coming in late July, early August. And so this is the word cloud that came from that response from the people who registered for the webinar. And you can see how much everybody has the sense how important trees are for summer heat, for the cooling and the shade they provide, but also for the beauty and the birds and the mental health perspective. And there's just lots of considerations here and just a myriad of benefits that are quantifiable and not so easily quantifiable. But I think there is a general understanding and appreciation of the benefits of trees, and now there's a lot of research to back it up. So the extent and quality of tree canopy corresponds to the magnitude of benefits provided by trees. And this is extremely important because trees are not equally distributed, especially in urban areas. And consistently, and as you'll hear later on, studies in Canada show that low-income and racialized communities generally have less tree cover and therefore fewer benefits. So I was asked to speak a little bit about sort of what the factors are influencing the distribution and quality of trees in urban areas. And it goes back a lot to just the history and the pattern of urbanization and the urban form and how towns and municipalities and cities, they've been growing and they've been changing and they're a human construct for the last maybe decades or centuries. And so with that, the pattern of development, the types of buildings that go up, the street patterns, and all of that influences the plantable space and the history and of the forest and the ability for trees to survive and thrive. And so on this photo, you can see this on the left, a high-rise building in my neighborhood and one tree at the bottom. So that is a very important tree, but it's one of the only ones for such a high dense neighborhood and building. In the middle, this is
Christine, sorry,
yeah.
my apologies. Could you move the little window that says stop sharing, which is on top of your presentation slides?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, all right.
I didn't know it was for everybody. Anyway, so the middle slide is another dense neighborhood in Montreal.
Now you've stopped sharing. If you could share again and just move that little window that
Okay.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, so I just have to move forward. Okay. All right, so this is just, again, going into just different residential areas and how the trees are dispersed unequally and in different quantities and qualities. And overall, there's been a lot of systematic inequalities and investments between neighborhoods that I think we'll get into the next presentation. We'll discuss more. But some neighborhoods are a lot leafier and benefit the presence of these large mature trees that are able to grow in place, obviously affect and have much.
Sorry, Christine, we've lost your audio. Thank you. Now you're back. Yeah, thank you.
Oh no. Okay. So my screen is being shared again?
Yeah.
Okay. So looking at a neighborhood with, say, 40% tree cover, so very, in that respect, that's a high tree cover, there are better health outcomes. There's reduced stress levels. There's boosted immune systems. The residents have increased recreational opportunities, and the list goes on and on. And areas with, say, 5 to 8%, which there are neighborhoods and in different cities, especially in Canada, you can see that the impacts, and the research is showing that there's increased mortality, especially from things like extreme heat waves that are increasing as the decades go on. So increased medical issues related to things like air pollution, the stress, and just generally a harsher environment to live and work. Okay, this is not, sorry about this. Wasn't on full screen. Okay, so I'm going to get into now. So what does Tree Canada is an organization that is central to tree planting and the care of trees and the idea of promoting equitable tree planting in communities across the country. What are the areas of focus that it has? So one of our areas of programming is related to greening communities, and that's providing grants to schools, community groups, Indigenous communities, and municipalities across Canada to plant trees. So it's a granting program. The grants are approximately $10,000 and include projects such as food forests, school naturalization projects, tiny forests, and municipal tree planting projects. So, and how does it relate to equity? Well, in this case, I'm just going to present the idea of 11 community projects in 2024 that were supported by Tree Canada using its unrestricted funds. So that's us prioritizing our resources to serve communities that have generally been negatively impacted by climate change or have underserved communities or vulnerable communities. And so when we are applying these tree planting grants, we use a screening tool to select projects that are located either in Indigenous communities or underserved communities where there's low tree canopy, the needs are great, and resources are limited. And we choose projects that have a strong community and or youth engagement component because the benefits are multiplied. So into 2024, for example, 11 projects were funded, And most of them are tree planting projects that also have additional aspects to them, such as fostering knowledge sharing, improving ecological literacy, improving social connection, and food security. So here's just two examples, not necessarily from this year, but in part of Tree Canada's community programs. So this is Whitefish River First Nation Library. It's a healing and edible garden on Birch Island in Ontario. And the other one on the right is a park project near sunny Summerside in PEI after Hurricane Fiona destroyed the park's old growth trees. And this is an important park for social connection and connection to nature. So another aspect of Tree Canada's work is a national greening program that I mentioned earlier. And so this is supporting large landowners with tree planting projects that contribute to forest rehabilitation, afforestation, or ecosystem restoration. So these are programs that support a lot of tree planting, so large numbers of trees under the 2 billion tree program, the federal government initiative. And the landowners benefit from Tree Canada's extensive experience in project design and its work with forestry specialists and other partnerships. So one example of a national greening program project that has an equity focus and this year is with an Indigenous community, the Claycho government, in partnership with Tree Canada and Let's Plant Trees. So the program is funded also with Tree Canada's unrestricted funds. So we're prioritizing our resources towards this program. And that is to plant 1 million trees after wildfire ravaged the community in 2020 and 2023. So why is it an equity focused project? Well, it's Indigenous led. And so it's an opportunity to support a community that has been affected by wildfires. And it's supporting ecosystem restoration and biodiversity, and is a partnership that is leading to supporting the community in terms of its ecological function. So here's a picture, not of the community itself, but of a recent photo from Northwest Territories, just near Whitehorse, or sorry, not the community itself. But anyway, this project that is focused on this community will plant deciduous trees such as trembling aspen and white birch on the east side of the community to slow down future wildfires. And this is a fire smart idea to have deciduous trees planted, but it's also going to be planting a lot of spruce trees and other trees that are important food for caribou, which is of course important to the community itself. So Tree Canada is also focused in a lot of research and engagement. So it supports and collaborates on innovative research on a variety of urban forest themes. The organization hosts the Canadian Urban Forest Network, the largest network across Canada of urban forest experts, academics, foresters, and arborists, and others who come together to learn, to share approaches, to share experience and expertise. And every 2 years, Tree Canada, along with a host city, hosts a Canadian Urban Forest Conference. And this network and the work that we do is extremely important to build the discipline of urban forestry and understanding and application of urban forest for the different communities across the country. And every year there's a sub-theme that's related to urban forestry that comes to the fold. And in the last few years, Tree Canada has been committed to focusing on equity and its intersection with urban forestry. So in 2023 and 2024, the e-lecture series was on equity, and those recordings are on our website. And in 2024, coming up this October, we're hosting a conference in Winnipeg called Trees for All, Equity in Canada's Urban Forest. And here's just a slide showing the website, Tree Canada's website, with the registration information and also more about this topic. So finally, another program that we're involved in is through a collaboration with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities on a 7-year program called Growing Canada's Community Canopies, or as we refer to it, it's the GCCC program. It's funded by the Government of Canada's 2 billion trees program, and it is a funding opportunity for municipalities of all sizes, all across Canada, to have funds for tree planting and strategic planning grants. And how it relates to equity in this case is Tree Canada's role in this program is to support the communities that apply and receive funding for this program by us convening and coordinating a network of urban forest specialists to help coach and peer review on the program. We also provide things like fact sheets. We produce fact sheets and guidebooks and training materials so that we're building and learning from each other and how to support small, medium, and large communities to be able to steward their urban forests. So through this funding, there's a lot of opportunities for municipalities of all sizes to increase tree canopies in underserved neighborhoods, to increase their strategic planning initiatives to better manage their urban forests, and to increase climate resilience, improve the quality and diversity of urban forests. So it's a 7-year program. Municipalities have up to $10 million in funding, from $50,000 to $10 million over the course of the 7 years. So there's lots of opportunities to really be ambitious and to have the resources to make a difference in your community. And we are there along with Federation of Canadian Municipalities to help coordinate the learning and increase the understanding and the support for this field. So this is the the Federation of Canadian Municipalities website that hosts the information. Anybody on this call today or anybody who's going to follow up, I suggest going to this to find out a lot more about this program and how municipalities and their community partners can receive funding. So Tree Canada and other communities like to say that it really comes down to the right tree in the right place. And I would just further say that in light of equity, we need to have the right conditions and the right reasons in the right place and with the right care. So finally, I'll just end with Tree Canada and looking forward. And what I'd like to say is that as an organization, Tree Canada is dedicated to ensuring that equity is a key consideration in our programs, and that we use our resources to support equity deserving and underserved communities, and that we use our platform, and we thoughtfully use the platform as a national organization to raise awareness and understanding related to the intersection of equity and tree canopy. And that also means questioning the status quo and trying to improve and innovate to do things differently. And finally, it's on focusing on the relationships and partnerships to ensure Tree Canada is responsible, and its work has long-term impact to build resilient communities. So if you'd like to know more about us, you can follow us on our channels, on all of these ones. And I look forward to the questions and also the next presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. And now, Maddie, over to you again to introduce the next presenters.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Christine. So great to have the opportunity to hear about tree equity from a group that's doing such great work on this issue. So the next presentation will be given by my colleagues at Nature Canada. So Erin is another reforestation organizer here, and in partnership with Sharmeena, they authored our 2022 Tree Equity Report, Bringing the Canopy to All. And so in their presentation, Erin and Sharmeena are going to go over the findings of this report in a bit more detail and offer some insights about the current status of tree equity in various locations across the country. So over to you, Erin and Sharmeena.
Great. Thanks so much, Maddie. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Just going to share my screen. Great. And if I can just get a thumbs up, Maddie, that you can see it okay. Awesome. Yeah, so I'm Erin, and I'll be presenting today alongside Sharmeena. So to begin, I just want to do a little bit of an imagination exercise. So just for a moment together, let's imagine that there's this machine, and it can help us curb climate change. It can drastically improve people's health, and it can make our cities safer and more enjoyable. So basically, all the things we want as a community, all the things we strive for, this machine can do it. It's amazing. But what if I told you that this machine, it's only going to be available to certain neighborhoods? And so only the rich neighborhoods, only the predominantly white neighborhoods, only those groups are going to have access to this machine and all of its benefits. At this point, you might be thinking, this is a little crazy. You know, why can't everyone just access this machine? And I 100% agree with you. However, this unequal distribution, it's already happening. We already have this machine, it's called trees. But unfortunately, it's generally the wealthier and or predominantly white neighborhoods across Canada who have the greatest tree canopy cover. And so this is just what it looks like on the ground. So this is 2 different neighborhoods in Calgary. Sorry, I just got to minimize something there. 2 different neighborhoods in Calgary, roughly around the same income levels, but that neighborhood on the right with a lot less trees has about 3 times the percentage of BIPOC folks. And BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And this neighborhood on the right, it was started to be developed around 20 years ago. So you might expect to see a little bit more trees there right now. And this is Toronto, 2 different neighborhoods, very different tree canopy cover percentages, very different levels of people in poverty and percentages of BIPOC folks. And it's not too hard to imagine what these 2 neighborhoods would feel like on that plus 35-degree days that we've been seeing quite a few of lately. And we'll be hearing more from Toronto and hearing how they are addressing tree equity later on in this webinar series. So today, we'll do a short poll just to find out what's everyone's familiarity with tree equity. Sharmeena will go through the history of urban forests briefly, and then talk a little bit about what is tree equity, the challenges to addressing it, some recommendations for municipalities to do so. And then I'll dive into the mapping, what's it looking like in Vancouver and some research out of Winnipeg, and then close it off with how to get involved, what can be done in your community. So you should be seeing a pop-up coming up on your screen. And there it is. And just take a moment to fill in these questions, help us get a sense of people's familiarity with tree equity. Okay, just give it another few moments. Lots of answers coming in. Yeah, so far there's a good percentage of people here are already familiar with tree equity, which is awesome. There's a few that aren't, and we're super happy you're here to learn more about it. Yeah, and then for the question number 2, is your city making efforts towards achieving tree equity? So this is a bit more split. Some are already doing it, 26% are doing it, 20% aren't doing it, and around 50% of people aren't sure. So again, great that you're here to be able to go back to your city and be able to ask them some questions afterwards. And then lastly, for our tree planters, some people are already considering tree equity and implementing it in their planting projects, which is awesome to see. 25% aren't currently, and then for some of them, it's not applicable. All right, great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for helping us get a sense of people's familiarity with tree equity. And you should be able to see the results. They're just coming up on your screen. But I'm just going to go ahead and stop sharing those results now. All righty. There we go. And now I'll just pass it over to Sharmeena.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, just to introduce myself, I was one of the researchers who worked on the Urban Tree Equity Report with Nature Canada. So just to get started first, I think it's important to cover a little bit of the history of why our neighborhoods were built the way they were. So urban forests can be traced back to the City Beautiful movement. It happened during the 1800s, and it was influenced by European romantic ideals. Because of this, green spaces were designed in a sort of heavily manicured way that focused on aesthetics. And this essentially ended up separating people from nature. So it displaced indigenous communities, for example, from their lands. And even up until today, pesticides are used in parks. And we don't ultimately notice the effects of this, but it prevents indigenous practices of harvesting food and medicinal plants. So it's important to consider this historical perspective of how neighborhoods came about and how urban forests came about, and to acknowledge that even if urban forests seem like neutral spaces, they do actually operate within a settler colonial framework
that perpetuates inequity even today. Next slide, sorry. Yeah. So I'm just going to, now that we've framed the historical perspective, I'm just going to briefly define tree equity. So tree equity refers to the fair and just distribution of tree canopy in urban areas. It ensures that all communities, regardless of race, age, and socioeconomic status, have equal access to the benefits provided by urban forests. This is just a brief definition, and I will go more deeply into it throughout the presentation as well. Yeah, we can continue to the next slide. So for our study, we had two main methods that we did. First, we conducted interviews with key informants, and this included municipal staff, urban foresters, practitioners in the urban environmental space, and reflected a range of expertise, including people from the BIPOC community as well. We also completed a map analysis of select Canadian cities and mapped out the relationship between tree cover, income, and race. So onto the next slide. So our interviews helped us identify certain challenges, which I'll be highlighting. So the very first challenge is around defining tree equity based on citywide targets. So there is a strong global agreement that cities should aim for at least 30 to 40% tree canopy cover. But the issue with this is that these citywide targets don't actually capture the nuances and consider whether all communities, especially marginalized and racialized ones, have fair access to green spaces. So what we really do need to consider is neighborhood level targets as well in order to truly capture the nuances. And going on to the next challenge, which involves the lack of an integrated planning process that values urban trees. So this stems from the mindset that essentially views trees as commodities rather than a general right for everyone. And in the past and even currently, developers often see urban forests and development as two competing interests. And so trees are often left out of the planning process entirely. And this type of emission later on creates barriers for when trees need to be planted. So firstly, because there's a lack of open space for the trees, and secondly, because there's also a lack of space at the subsurface level where the roots of trees tend to interfere with telephone lines and utilities. So then in the end, trees are now also viewed as a public hazard in many places where they weren't previously planned into the neighborhood. So yeah, moving on to the third challenge. What we heard from a lot of our interviews was the lack of funding. So interviews felt that only with reliable funding will we be able to really expand urban tree cover to marginalized neighborhoods. A lot of funding programs are often unfortunately constrained and can't encompass the full range of maintenance and care for urban forests. So to some extent, this also requires property owners to take an active role in watering and caring for the trees. And this then disproportionately affects low-income areas. And the reason that that happens is because they have less financial means to care for the trees around their property spaces. And so that leads to fewer trees and higher mortality rates in these areas. So yeah, moving on to another challenge, which is related to the lack of incentives for planting on private land. So a lot of our interviews also mentioned that there is a lot of potential for canopy growth on private land, but that engagement of private landowners is still limited. So it's important to note here that low-income communities are often also mostly made up of renters, and they tend to have less agency in being able to plant trees on private land. So because of this, it's important to account for the fact that they rely on community-owned private spaces as well for access to green spaces. And yeah, that needs to be considered. Moving on to the final challenge, which refers to the lack of community engagement. This was probably one of the most important challenges. It became clear that the lack of engagement is largely due to insufficient funding. So without a consistent budget, it's very difficult for municipalities to continue to build that relationship with communities. But we also learned through our interviews that access to green spaces has a very different meaning for different people. and that all the perspectives need to be heard. So for example, one of our interviewees mentioned how Indigenous knowledge is often missed out of tree planting processes. So the idea of planting the right native trees is important to them and needs to be considered. Another interviewee talked about the preference for fruit-bearing trees for immigrant neighborhoods, and that also needs to be accounted for. So moving on to the recommendations. Before I speak about the recommendations, I do want to acknowledge that a lot is already being done across multiple cities. And for example, Toronto is one of the first cities to use the tree equity score, which rates tree equity from 1 to 100 across neighborhoods. So yeah, but there is a lot that is being done, but just for our recommendations, we also uncovered through our interviews several key things that I want to highlight. So the first is measuring urban tree equity accurately. I mentioned that citywide canopy targets don't necessarily capture inequity. So our first recommendation is around building a credible tree inventory at the neighborhood level for all cities. This type of inventory would provide a clear picture of the extent of tree canopy cover and equitable access. Secondly, onto the next slide. It's important to build urban forest strategies into the planning process. So programs to increase urban tree equity need to be created in tandem with municipal land use policies. And inventories can help play a role in this because they can help set neighborhood-specific targets, especially for priority areas with low canopy cover. So in terms of targets, Nature Canada recommends the 330-300 principle. So I'm just going to read that out. So everyone should be able to see at least 3 trees from their home. Communities should ensure a 30% tree canopy cover in all neighborhoods, and all residents should have green space of at least 1 hectare within 300 meters of where they're living. So that's just one example of, that's an example of a potential target that could be set for neighborhoods. And moving on to the next recommendation, it's important to incentivize tree planting on private land. So in general, education is needed, as well as incentives to empower homeowners to understand how to plant the right trees. But because low-income groups are also less likely to be homeowners, it is important that municipalities partner with local nonprofits that connect with the private sector. So for example, LEAF is an organization in Toronto that provides tree planting services to multi-unit condos, businesses, and even has incentives for low canopy areas. And the fourth recommendation is about urban forest quality. So it's not just about having trees, but also about having high quality green spaces. And in order to do this, it's important to focus on connecting fragmented landscapes across the city, because this would act as a corridor for wildlife and also then help ensure biodiversity, or reverse biodiversity loss across neighborhoods. And moving on to the final recommendation, it's important to define urban tree equity beyond quantitative measures. So while canopy inventories address proximity, it's crucial that these green spaces are not only well distributed, but high quality, but also safe and welcoming. People should feel that they are able to engage with green spaces in the way that makes sense to them. And to achieve this, we must open up the decision-making process to include voices of racialized and marginalized communities. So there are 2 aspects of this I want to highlight. Onto the next, one is working with Indigenous communities as the original caretakers of the land and prioritizing that meaningful relationship with them. And the second is engaging racialized and marginalized communities throughout the process. So this could be done through, for example, engaging with tenant and neighborhood associations, which are a great way to reach large groups of people and hear their perspectives. And so onto the next slide. So overall, our report took an in-depth look into what inequitable access to urban forests meant to people, and learned that equity needs to be defined in the most comprehensive way possible. So one of our key takeaways is that to truly improve urban tree equity, we need to intentionally share power with those marginalized by the current processes and allow them to redesign these processes as well. So the definition of tree equity that we've constructed based on this involves incorporating proximity quality biodiversity, but also equitable governance, which involves empowering marginalized communities to have a part in the decision-making process at every stage. And yeah, thank you. So I'm going to pass it back to Erin.
Great, thanks so much, Sharmeena. So the second part of our research was mapping the issue. We did it for quite a few cities across the country, and I'm just going to highlight here Vancouver. There's a lot going on here, but I'll help walk us through it. So essentially, the bigger the blue dot, the higher the median income. And the bigger the orange dot is higher the BIPOC population. And again, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color. And so if we just first look to those highest green neighborhoods, the darker green neighborhoods, you kind of concentrated more over in the west side of the city. And what you start to see there is that the highest tree canopy neighborhoods are also the highest, have very high income earners, as well as relatively lower BIPOC populations. There is an exception, the downtown core, which has very high income levels and relatively, or just very low tree canopy. It's up in the north there, the white areas, the light green areas. And this is a trend that we did see across the country, that downtown cores tend to have sparser tree canopies and don't necessarily follow a trend. But if we just turn our attention now to the lighter green and white areas over in the east side of the city and in the south, you do start to see that trend again of higher BIPOC populations and lower income levels. And Killarney down there in that southeast corner, that's another exception, but most of that canopy is actually coming from a golf course and a park. And it's just a good reminder that these are trends that we're talking about. There are many neighborhoods that are lower income and or higher BIPOC populations, and they have high tree canopy cover, which is excellent. And this is just a different perspective of looking at the same issue. So again, this is of Vancouver, and all those neighborhoods outlined in yellow, those are the neighborhoods with a tree canopy cover of 30% or and higher. And 30%, as Sharmeena mentioned, is what we recommend, and a lot of academic research recommends should be the target for neighborhoods. And what we just appreciate about this map is that it really drives home the point that we need to have neighborhood level canopy targets. It is possible for a city to meet its canopy goals while their canopy being concentrated in specific parts of the city and other parts being left out. So yeah, it's just really important to have those neighborhood level canopy goals. And this is another map of Vancouver, Winnipeg, and this actually comes from Ian Dyke there. And I just wanted to highlight it because it's research that looked at income and race in relation to tree canopy, but also took into consideration disease management. So what Ian found was that Dutch elm disease and emerald ash borer, they actually threaten to decimate over 50% of Winnipeg's trees in the coming decades. So this can have huge consequences for the urban forest. And through Ian's research, he found that the marginalized communities, the lower income communities, and or higher BIPOC neighborhoods, they had infection rates of these diseases of up to 10%, which is very high. And when he was looking at the higher income neighborhoods and predominantly white neighborhoods, he was seeing Dutch elm disease infection rates of 2% and lower. So, this research is just super important in driving home the idea that cities also need to be considering equity in their disease management strategies. So why do we need to be addressing tree equity? Christine went over all the important reasons earlier, but just want to emphasize that when a community fails to ensure tree equity, they're failing to serve all of its members. They're leaving an already marginalized people at a disadvantage. So addressing tree equity is not just about fairness, it's also about building healthier, happier, and safer communities for everyone. So we need to be asking, which neighborhoods are experiencing tree equity? Do your local decision makers know about it? Is it a priority for them? And who else in your community cares about it? Because tree equity is an intersectional issue. And so we're stronger and we'll be more effective when we come together. to work on this issue. And lastly, for our tree planters out there, how can you be centering equity in your planting projects? And as we saw in the poll, many of you already are, which is awesome. So these were just a few recommendations and ways for community groups to work towards equity in their cities. And again, start off by building that coalition with other groups, finding out who else is in your city, who else cares about this, to make sure we have many perspectives at the table. And then working together to develop a campaign strategy. You know, what is it we're trying to achieve and how are we going to do it? Other ways for groups to work towards tree equity is, you know, meeting with your counselors and urban forestry staff. See, are they working on this? Are they already thinking about it? Is it a priority for them? Yeah, so these are just a few ideas and starting points for community groups. And of course, we are here to support. We want to be working with groups. We offer advocacy support, one-on-one phone calls. As you go through this process, we connect groups with one another, whether in your area or in different parts of the country who are coming up against the same issue. We can do that connection piece. We're also coming out with a toolkit, which I'll just touch on a little in the next slide. That'll be coming out in the fall. We have a community of practice that will be meant to bring groups from across the country together to develop their campaign strategies, as well as learn from one another and help work through any roadblocks they're experiencing. And we offer capacity building, so different training sessions and small grants at certain times of the year. So I just want to give a little sneak peek into our toolkit. So it has lots of different sections to it, but the main point is to guide groups through the process of developing a campaign strategy. So it goes into, you know, how to build that coalition. Who are other groups you could be looking for in your city to partner with and work with on this issue, share the load, the workload. And then the next step is, you know, that we dive into in the toolkit is how to approach this work respectfully and recognizing that the different groups at the table will be coming to the table with different levels of privilege. And then the toolkit walks groups through answering these questions. Who are our people? Who's going to support us in this work? Who can show up and help work towards tree equity? You know, what are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish? What's our theory of change? How are we going to do it? And what are our tactics to achieve all this? So this is our mission. We want to be supporting community groups across the country in their efforts to ensure that every neighborhood, regardless of income or race, are benefiting and thriving, or are benefiting from a thriving urban forest. This is the main purpose of my role. And so if this is what you want to be working on, I would love to hear from you. We want to work with you and help work towards tree equity in all cities. And I just want to leave you with this quote. It's from Janella Point at Stellarton First Nation. Diversity is not just a strength. Anti-racism is not a burden. It's the only way we can address the root causes of the climate crisis. Anti-racism is how we will win. I would also add that this is true for the biodiversity crisis. But essentially, this is our why. This is our why we're doing this work, and we hope that you will join us in doing it. So we would love to hear from you. We're going to put a link in the chat for you to fill out a form and indicate interest in any of the areas that I just mentioned, and continue the conversation and work towards tree equity together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erin, Christine, Sharmeena, and Maddie. So we have a lot of questions. So I just want to, before we jump into the questions, I just want to share with everyone a link to a feedback form on the chat. We appreciate your feedback, so please let us know what you think. And now on to the questions, which we have a lot of, and we have about 10 or so minutes to answer them. And I've tried grouping them into the best way possible so the questions are interrelated. Let's start off with the equity questions. I'll ask these two questions at the same time because they're interrelated. One is from Elizabeth Blocker, and she asks, how does Tree Canada determine where equity-deserving, underserved communities are located? And what indicators do you use to assess these criteria? And then from Juno Stewart, how does tree equity affect children in low income and mostly treeless daycare playgrounds? And how does this affect health and well-being?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the questions. Maybe I'll take the first one, I guess, especially because it relates directly to Tree Canada. And so in a couple parts, so we do have programs where we put out a call for applications. So when we're asking for applications for community grants or applications for the larger National Greening Program funding, we certainly ask the question about where the trees are going to be planted. So there is an equity question that we're asking. And so we're not determining where those communities are, but we're asking communities to self-identify or give us the information that we have to go on the basis. So there has to be rationale for why those trees are going into that particular location. So that's basically how we address it. And just in terms of just the way we're always presenting that the work that we do is we are emphasizing our resources, and especially when we're using our unrestricted funds to actually go out and seek and to promote our work to communities that would otherwise probably not know about the work that we do or these opportunities. They're not in big city centers, but smaller communities. And that's why we're looking for partnerships and collaboration and learning from people who are telling us where sort of more marginalized communities or vulnerable communities would be. So we do have some criteria that we're looking for. We're also working in communities. We have an Operation Relief program that's the communities that have been affected by climate change disasters. And so with flooding or with derechos or wildfires. So those are communities that are seeking funding and seeking partnerships. And that's where we'll be most effective in working with them.
And I can add in there too. In the next webinar series next week, there'll be two groups, City of Toronto and the Calgary Climate Hub, that will be showcasing their maps. And that will be a great opportunity to see how they are identifying the underserved communities and what factors they're taking into consideration in determining which neighborhoods are the priorities. And this actually touches on the question around the impact of equity on children. That tree equity score that those two groups next week have implemented, the methodology that they're following, age is a factor that is considered, both for the young people as well as our elders. And so that's it's crucial. These are developing little bodies of these little kids at the daycare, and sometimes you see them in my neighborhood of the daycares right beside busy roads and not too much green space. So there's definitely big impacts there, and the tree equity score that we'll see next week takes age into the equation.
Yeah, there's definitely resources out there about the health impacts, especially for vulnerable communities, especially young children or old people. And so I would say Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, they have lots of information about not only the benefits to nature connections, but also the harms when that is lacking in their environment.
Thank you, Erin and Christine. Now, there are a lot of questions about municipalities and bylaws, and looking for any specific municipality that has enacted effective bylaws. So where can people find these bylaws that have been passed and that have been proven effective?
Yeah, I can just add there. I did have this question come up recently, actually, and I had reached out to one of our partners, the Local Enhancement and Appreciation of Forests in Toronto, to see if they know of any great bylaws out there. And they recommended, or they pointed me in the direction of Markham, Newmarket, Burlington, and what they appreciated about those bylaws is that they have a threshold of 20 centimeters diameter and higher. And so that's, and then there was also another report from the Clean Air Partnership that dug into private tree bylaws. The research, what makes a strong bylaw. So I can share those links if you reach out to me. Yeah.
And I'll just add that Tree Canada has, the Canadian Urban Forest Network. So it has a couple resources. So one being a listserv. So somebody could ask that question. They join this network. They can ask that question to a listserv of people across the country. And it's really fun to actually see when a question that is very specific gets a lot of traction and lots of responses to guide you or point you into direction. Tree Canada also has a compendium on its website. So it is about highlighting and having lots of resources as reference materials to go learn about urban forest management plans, and within those, sometimes the policies and bylaws. And so it's also, you can check it out because it's by theme, and soon it will be on a digital platform and much more interactive. But at this point, it is still a resource that's available, and it's compendium of best practices related to urban forests. So certainly bylaws come into that.
Thank you, Christina. And I have a question here from Anne Lowen, which I think captures some other questions asked by other people. What are the supports, including any ongoing funds and community participation, for maintenance and nurturing of trees once they have been planted? I have observed that many newly and recently planted trees do not survive, especially with extreme environmental conditions they experience.
Well, that's the crux of it. So it's all of those things. We've all seen a lot of tree planting projects that have not.
Unfortunately, I think Christine has frozen.
Oh,
Is it better now? No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. All to say that those are very important considerations. What is the aftercare for trees that are planted? So it does have to be the right tree because we're facing this more extreme environments. We have to make sure that the tree selection is extremely important, where the stock comes from, where it is going to be placed in relation to all the other infrastructure around it. So it is such a careful and thoughtful process that's needed to decide where ultimately and which types of trees to be planted, and with all the community other considerations. And then on top of that, it is the maintenance and the care following that. So with the community grants, we're more likely to see that community engagement afterwards, following up with stewardship and support. So that's something that we ultimately look for. And then, for example, for the Growing Canada's Community Canopies program, the funds are available for 3 years. So it's 1 year to plant trees and then another year to help protect them and maintain them, and then a year for auditing. So that's built into that larger program that we're involved with. But for all of the programs, there has to be consideration for the ongoing maintenance and stewardship of those trees following the planting. We've all seen too many lost opportunities, and it's just very sad and wasteful.
Thank you, Christine. Now we're at the top of the hour. I will ask one more question, and then I leave it to Christine and Erin to have final words. So our final question is from Doug Heavener. He's asking, how can a robust educational information program enhance the success of tree equity in the urban space?
yeah, I think it's crucial, that the education piece, the community piece, raising awareness within our community, building community power to then work together on this issue. A lot of municipalities are very receptive to it. They see the benefit, and so having the community support is crucial, and that education is very important.
I absolutely agree, and I'm quite excited to see the toolkit that you're working on, because community involvement in these overall, well, towns and cities that we live in is absolutely critical. It's also there to provide a lot of guidance and support to municipalities for those investments. So it's those engagement points that you were talking about with council, with different community groups coming together, sharing that, empowering communities to be reaching out and engaging in the decision making and governance. It's all critical.
Thank you so much, Christine and Erin. Any last words?
I would just say thank you. Yeah, we're super passionate about this topic. We want to be continuing the conversation with everyone. And so I really encourage you just to fill in that form or reach out to me by email, and we'll set up a call and see what we can do about it together.
And my final words will just be, yeah, thank you to everybody who helped organize this, and knowing that this topic is extremely important. Grateful that there's a couple more sessions following up, but there are Tree Canada's resources as well from its equity series on tree equity from the last year or two, and then the upcoming conference. If you'd like to join us, we'd love to have you. So thank you.
All right. Thank you once again to Sharmeena, Erin, Christine, and Maddie, and to Bruce doing the back end stuff. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Just as a reminder that you will get a copy of the presentation slides and the recording within 1 business day. And see you all next week for the next session. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.